Hi, and welcome to the 21st episode of the Nonstop Podcast with Pooja. With me, I have Surabhi. Surabhi is a leading name in the field of international law. She's a professor. She's known for doing work in ocean and ocean-related policies and regulations, and she's an overall superstar. And I would say from India to Cambridge, her name is quite popular in the field, and she's doing some significant work and changes both in terms of international law and ocean. So welcome to the podcast, Surabhi. Thanks for accepting and being with me.
Thank you for having me, Pooja, and thank you for that very generous and totally undeserved introduction, but thank you.
Okay, without further ado, I will give the floor to you to say a few words to correct me if I had any hyperbolic sentences about you. So who are you and how did you land up in Cambridge, and how was the journey from India to Cambridge as an international lawyer?
Thank you. Okay, so as you said, I am a professor of international law here at Cambridge, and I think the hyperbolic sentence there might have been that I'm a known name across India and the UK, because I don't think international lawyers benefit from so much name recognition unless they happen to be prominent practitioners for states or whatever, whereas I think I would qualify myself as an academic international lawyer. So a lot of my work is on the history and politics of international law. I do a lot of work in critical legal thinking, which means that I suppose, unfortunately, mostly other academics might know me, but not the world at large. But how did I end up here? So my journey was actually from India to the UK via the US. I did my first law degree in Bangalore at the National Law School, from where I went to New York to NYU for my master's degree, and I worked in New York for a couple of years. And then I came to Cambridge to do my PhD, and I sort of, stayed on in the UK. I taught at a different university for a while, and then I came back to Cambridge. You asked me, how did the journey feel? For me, I grew up in Delhi, and then I studied in Bangalore. And then I went to New York. Coming to Cambridge felt like really coming to a very, very small place after three big cities, right? So I remember the first thing that happened to me was I arrived here on a Sunday evening, and I realized all the shops were shut after 5 o'clock. So I couldn't even buy a toothbrush. And I was just like, what is this place that I have come to? I want to go back to like the big, cities that I was used to. But now, of course, I've gotten used to it and like it very much. And I've discovered that even though it's a small city, it's actually quite vibrant in terms of the number of things that happen here, particularly during term time. So I hope you're enjoying your stay here as well, Pooja.
Yeah, I think it's a very appropriate discussion of how Cambridge feels. Coming from big cities, being a part of India, I think we kind of idealize the noise and we equate it to the more happening scenario. But Cambridge being the bubble that it is, I feel they're all launchpad centered, and the vibe of being an international sphere in law, you see how much more is happening concretely, even though the space is very small. Yeah. There's not a lot of external noise, but there's definitely a lot of internal noise and a lot of right voices taking things to the next step. Which brings me to the next set of questions to ask you. I did not undermine when I said you're a known name in the ocean law. And when I was drafting questions for you, I was very interested and very keen, because most often when people hear things such as law or policy, for a common man, it would feel a set of rhetoric rules that are put together, and in application, it just seems too rigid, right? But in the sphere that you're researching, which is deep sea mining and the ocean, we don't often have enough knowledge or research or awareness on what goes beneath us and around us, right? So there is specific subjects that I'm going to push to you. And I generally don't have a script in front of me, but because you've done so much, I have to quote you quite a bit in this aspect of things. So I came across your interview with Hindustan Times, which is one of the prominent media publishers in India.
Yes.
And you have said that the ocean is incredibly crowded and that no part of it is untouched by humans. What really do you mean by this? And what is really happening to our oceans today?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I think what I was trying to explain even in that interview is that very often when we think of the ocean, and this is partly because of the result of a lot of the literature we might have read or how we've been taught to think of the ocean, we always think of it as this massive, vast, remote, world outside of sort of human civilization, with the whole sea out there that has almost no, this is the Grotian terminology, right? The sea, the human activity can do nothing to the sea. The ocean is unoccupiable, it's untransformable, it's not possessable. It coheres in a way that land does not. So there's always this sense that the sea somehow exceeds the human capacity for transforming the world. And in fact, that's not true, because one of the things I do in my class when I teach a class in oceans law is I begin with showing students just a whole bunch of maps of the ocean, and these are maps of human presence in the ocean. So I show them the ways in which jurisdiction has extended into the ocean. I show them maps of fishing activity in the seas. I show them maps of submarine cables in the ocean. I show them maps of sites which have been earmarked for deep seabed exploration with the intent of seabed mining. I show them, sort of navigational maps, ships going everywhere. And then in the end, I try to, and one map I show them, which is truly frightening, is of course the map of plastics accumulating in the sea. And then there are of course images of things that you cannot map, things like where might be the graves of people who were drowned in the course of the slave trade, and so on. And then I try to bring all these images together and show the students that once you put all of these images together, you put them onto one map, what do you see? You see that the ocean is absolutely crowded. It's crowded with footprints of human activity. It's crowded with the actual presence of humans. So the amount of shipping that goes on in the seas at any given time is, once you look at one of these images that are produced with real-time data, it's shocking. You realize there's no such thing as a remote ocean where there's nothing to see for miles. Actually, you'll probably see other ships everywhere you are. The food you eat will bear signs of human activity, in the sense that we know increasingly in the news that fish are sort of, choked with plastic. The ocean is a massive carbon sink, but now that the ocean is heating, and then there are all these extractive plants for seabed mining and so on, it's become a new threat in terms of what kinds of carbon will it release into the atmosphere. The ocean is acidifying. So human activity has, I argue, significantly transformed the ocean, both as a political space, as a legal space, and certainly as an ecological space. And those transformations are coming back to haunt us in very sort of large ways when you think about the fate of states that might face the threat of complete extinction, right? Because they might sink under the sea. And in small ways, in the sense of microplastics that sort of come into our bloodstreams through the seafood we eat, but it's the microplastics that we have put into the sea. So it's the ocean. We are in this imbricated relationship with the ocean, whether we recognize it or not. And in fact, going further, the very fact that we're having this conversation and that we're able to transmit it to the world is because we're making use of, again, an oceanic technology of the submarine cable. Without that, there would be no sort of global data exchange. So the ocean is really a part of our everyday lives in ways that we should stop and think about more, is what I argue. And we should see the ways in which we so completely occupy the ocean as human beings, and then think about what we can do to ensure a more sustainable future for ourselves and for the ocean.
Yeah, I started off with a very light question, almost a question of what is ocean for, and an ocean understanding for, rookies. But we also have to stop the very basic question and then move on a little further to all the incredible work that you're aiming at doing and contributing. So what would you say is the statistics of exploitation that is allowed? And I assume it's quite, we're already on the red zone now.
Oh yeah, I think we're much beyond the red zone, to be honest, because I think the real concern, so one of the ways you see this is people who sort of map tipping points, right? And where have they been breached? And you find, and tipping points being tipping points that will lead us into these irreversible sort of paths towards climate crisis that are then hard to pull back from. And you find very often that in relation to a lot of ocean activities, we are really well ahead of where we should be. We should be doing a lot less in terms of exploiting the ocean. We're already doing too much. And this is interesting because one of the ways in which the climate crisis is being thought about is how it can be addressed by actually exploiting more ocean resources, not less. So there's a whole shift to different blue economy visions as a way of meeting the demands of, producing food or producing, energy in different ways through using ocean resources. And yet ocean fragility is at a very, very perilous level. So it's really a difficult conundrum. And to give you just two important, not in terms of percentage statistics, but two important key indicators of this. fishing. So we talk a lot about the problems of illegal fishing, but actually legal fishing, that is to say fishing that is regulated by quotas that are allotted to different fishing fleets of different states, is already set at a very highly unsustainable level, which is why we are seeing a complete collapse of fish stocks in so many essential fish stocks, including things like tuna. And the other one is seabed mining, which is not yet an industry that is seabed mining has not begun in a commercially significant way, but there are 31 exploration licenses for very large parts of the ocean that have been given out to corporations and states. And if seabed mining is to begin, it's just going to be in terms of, I can't even begin to explain the scale of the disaster there will be in terms of marine pollution and in terms of sort of the escalation of the climate crisis because of the feedback loops in terms of carbon emissions that this will cause.
So you cannot give us a number. You could only tell us that it's negative and it's a very stretched minus.
I think it's hard to give numbers just because, of course, statistics are collected, but one of the problems that we do face in the oceanic context is also data verification, right? So the data is very siloed. It's different. There's data is collected at national levels, yes, but again, we're not 100% because it's very hard to sort of confirm the probity of statistics. It's very hard to say we are doing this with 30% in excess of what we should be because those numbers are not clear. I think the problem here is that we, in a way, I would even say that emphasizing those points, I think, reproduces the problem because it suggests that the only thing we need to do is reduce our targets and we'll be fine. It's one of the critiques that has been made of the climate change regime as well, that in a way, trying to turn everything into the problem of exactly how much carbon you can emit actually turns our attention away from the much larger structural problems that are sort of illuminated by climate change. And so I would say the same for the ocean as well.
Okay. Well, that takes me to the next question. Everything, what I've written here seems quite Latin. So I will ask you a simpler definition of what it means for those who are listening who not necessarily have, who have stopped until this point and are interested to understand what the ocean is and what really, to the depth, we are in direct contradiction to the ocean's life. So you have also written a piece which was published in a journal in Berlin where you noted that the manganese noodles are more than just raw materials. They carry stories of the Cold War, the decolonization and international law. So the question is, which of these stories do you find the most revealing about the nations that compete and cooperate underwater?
Yeah, so manganese nodules are really interesting things, right? These are these objects, they look like potatoes, like dirty potatoes. That's how they're described. They were first they've been, we've known about them for a long time. The famous 19th century Challenger expedition dredged up a few manganese nodules, brought them back. But nobody thought very much about these rocks because they were not very interesting looking. And at that point, everybody was really fascinated by the other kinds of things that these expeditions brought back, which was these unique forms of life and, and so on. So there was no interest. In the 1960s, manganese nodules were almost accidentally rediscovered by literally there's one story goes that this one guy found some samples of nodules in a drawer. He pulled them out. He decided to run a few tests to see what they actually contained and discovered that these are really rich concentrations of minerals that have become quite important for industrial processes, including things like cobalt, copper, manganese, which is iron, and so forth. And so as with his discovery, and he wrote a couple of books, he wrote an article in the Scientific American popularizing this, they suddenly became an object of real interest. Because states began to realize that one way in which they could try to secure their supplies of all these essential minerals was by mining the seabed. And this is, of course, important in a context of decolonization because what was happening at the same time was a lot of nationalization of natural resources, right? So places like, Chile and other places in South America, but also countries in Africa like Congo or like in Asia, like India and so on. Everybody was pursuing this idea of permanent sovereignty over natural resources and was trying to actually limit how many of these resources were extracted and exported for foreign use, right? So they were trying to nationalize their resource extraction industries. They were creating export limitations and so on. And so in the West, this created a real concern about supply security. Where would they get the raw materials they needed for their industrial processes from? And that led to an interest in the seabed resources. Likewise, the Cold War was relevant for this because, again, the Cold War was in some ways a war for accumulating, the raw material of the world, so that to feed into different models of industrial development. And again, Cold War states on both sides were again worried about what their supply chains would look like, what supply security would mean, but also were competing with each other to build bigger and bigger things, right? The space race, the arms race, that sort of thing. And so again, nodules became part of that story as well. And so that's why the quest for nodules was really a story about decolonization. The Cold War, there was also in the 60s a real imagination of what would life in the sea look like. Is there a future for humanity that would be an aquatic future? So one of the things we saw were people developing plans for these grand cities that could be built to be on the seafloor or to be built in just floating waters, with the sense that this is how humanity might live in the future. And so again, this idea that would mean living in greater proximity with the ocean, using sort of directly using the resources of the ocean. There were really grand plans for using ocean waves as a source of energy production, or fish farming, or training dolphins to act like sheepdogs. All of these weird things were being thought about. And so nodules also became part of those stories, right? That this will be like going out, and like we mine on land, we'll be mining in the sea and living in the sea and so on at the same time. There are lots of interesting stories though. So there's one interesting decolonization story is for third world states as well. They were interested in the possibility of seabed mining because they thought that these nodules could become a major source of development capital to feed into their development projects. But they were also terrified. Most of them had had experience of colonization. They knew colonization was about, sort of colonial powers and colonial corporations coming in, taking the resources, going away, and then just bringing the goods to sell to these people, right? And a lot of sort of coercion and violence in both processes. And so they were trying to think if there's a possibility for creating new models of resource extraction that would be more collectivist and less sort of coercive and competitive, right, between states. And so they proposed a seabed mining regime that would basically be a collectivist regime. All states would participate in creating and regulating an entity that they call the Enterprise, after Star Trek, the Enterprise, which they said would conduct mining on behalf of humanity. This was a really sort of vision of what would, a major sort of what would it be like to run an advanced industry, but not in terms of questions about competition and profit, really in terms of questions about collectivism and redistribution. That vision didn't succeed, but it was a very interesting vision to be brought about. Other kinds of fun stories. There was a point, you might have heard of this story because I think there was a film also made about this at one point, but a Russian submarine sank fairly close, when I say fairly close, 1,000 miles out of the west coast of the United States. And the US was really keen to recover this Russian submarine because they thought it was a nuclear submarine, and they thought if they could recover essential parts of it, they would learn a lot about the USSR's nuclear program. But they didn't want the USSR to know that they were trying to recover this submarine, because obviously then the USSR would come and try to stop them from doing that. So they just made up a cover story. They got like a Hollywood director to help them, I think, with this. And they got this one eccentric billionaire, Howard Hughes, to act as the cover person for this story. And they said Howard Hughes is really interested in seabed mining. And so he's building a giant ship that will be a seabed mining ship. Actually, they were building the ship to recover the Russian submarine. This was called the Glomar Challenge. This was called the Glomar Explorer. And so the ship was built. The cover story stayed in place. I think they were able to retrieve some parts of the Russian submarine, and the cover was only blown a few weeks later accidentally when I think some documents were stolen from Howard Hughes' office, and it turned out that among them was also the cover story of the Glomar Explorer. So it's interesting how, not the actual mining, but the pretense of mining has also been part of Cold War cover-up stories. But this pretense of mining did some interesting work, because some states by now, this happened in the mid-70s, and some states had been very skeptical about the technological feasibility of seabed mining. Can it really be done? It's a nice idea, but can you really go and mine 3 miles below the sea? Think of all the difficulties that might be with the amount of pressure and so on that you'll be dealing with. But then the Glomar Explorer story convinced them that no, this one guy seems to have built a ship that can do this, so maybe it can be done. And so it made many more people think about mining as a practical feasibility. And who knows how many people were inspired to put investments into seabed mining as a result of this fake story about seabed mining that the CIA had put out with the help of Howard Hughes. So that's interesting. And in fact, when the CIA has this famous line, right, when they say we can't confirm or deny, that's called the GLOMA response. And that comes out of when they were asked questions about the GLOMA explorer. They were asked, is it really recovering a Russian submarine? They were like, we can't confirm or deny. And so that's how it's become a famous catchphrase. So seabed mining is really part of all sorts of popular histories and decolonial histories and anti-colonial histories and political economic stories that we can think about.
So basically, ocean exploration is all the way from Cold War to Hollywood.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, yeah, on that note, let's see the couple of other interesting questions that my little script has for you.
Mm-hmm.
So, one of the most popular award, the most prestigious award, I wouldn't say popular, I would say the prestigious award is the Max Planck Award. Anything that comes from the institution, because they're very deeply rooted in not just prestige but also research of a certain quality. And very befittingly, you've been awarded this very recently. And so the award recognizes your work on race for resources and its colonial and geopolitical dimensions. So we've spoken a lot on how colonization, not just from the global south, because we are very much from the global south, had roots there, but there were substantial colonizations happening even in the Pacific.
Yes.
And a lot of the mining and the ocean mining is directly related to the Pacific, which would be my next question.
Yeah.
But what was this award for? And of course, I think it's already a grand reveal on the internet what you were awarded. So I'm not going to ask you on an audit on what you're doing with it.
Right.
But what is the fund going to be used? And of course, as a social scientist myself in the making, I would also think most often the question is it really worth investing in social sciences? Yeah. When the world very well geopolitically is, on the spectrum of deregulation, more on the authoritativeness, is autocracy really useful for, rule making? Because now it looks like rules are being
broken more than,
Yes, so there is no bridges to the gap. So why do you think this research money, or in terms of an award, is going to be useful? And do you really think social sciences has some work in this?
Yeah, no, I think those are really good. They're really important questions. So also to explain a bit about the award. So the award is jointly awarded by the Humboldt Foundation, the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and the Max Planck Society. And the way it functions is that it rotates every year between sciences. So 1 year it will be awarded for physical and natural sciences. The second year, it will be awarded for biological and medical sciences, and then third year for social sciences, and then the cycle will starts again, right? So this is now, I think, in the second or third cycle of the awards. And so the year previous to me, somebody would have got it for biological sciences, and the year previous to that was somebody in the physical sciences. I think why they include the social sciences is, in part, precisely because of what you say are the difficulties confronting the world today, right? So we do have a sense the physical sciences help us perhaps understand the world in certain ways better. The biological sciences do the same, and both these sort of branches help us also develop technologies and approaches that might help people in different ways. But I think the social sciences are also seen as a very essential part of that, right? I think social sciences give us a sense. They are the sciences that help us study, again, to understand the world better, because what they study is human societies, they study human histories, they study human politics, they study human cultures. They also help us understand critically what is important and what is not, right? There are no given answers to these questions. We have to think about where we want to go as a matter as a decision that is informed by, of course, empirical evidence, but also by a lot of normative philosophy, by a lot of thinking about what kinds of futures do people really want, what kinds of futures should people really want, all those sorts of questions. And that sort of stuff is the kind of work that social science does. And that, I would say, is also true for research in the law, right? Because on the one hand, of course, it's about, okay, what rules do we have? What do the rules mean? But a lot of our work is also in what do the rules do, right? What kinds of societies do they construct? What kinds of futures do they enable? What kinds of relationships with the ocean or with other aspects of nature do they codify? What do rules make possible and impossible? So beyond the question of what happens if rules are broken? How do we enforce them? Is the primary question of what do the rules actually say and show us about the world? And that again is a question that is not, it can't be answered without deep and careful study and reflection, I think. So the award given to me is, I think, with the idea of furthering a project that helps us do precisely that. So my project is going to be called Ways of World Making, the Global South and the Reimagination of Global Ocean Governance. And here what is animating the project is the understanding that there's a lot of thinking ongoing, right? Again, because of the crisis that the world faces today in so many different ways, economic crisis, ecological crisis, climate crisis, what people have called polycrisis, right? So many factors that it's hard even to say what the crisis really is. There's a lot of thinking going on about what can be done. And that thinking involves, on the one hand, the development of quite grand blue economy projects that many states are floating, the development of regimes for global governance that are being sort of, articulated at various international forums, and a lot of interesting plans, programs, policies, blueprints that are being developed at different levels. So not just at national or international levels, but at local levels, by collectives, by movements, by indigenous groups and other groups that have quite close relationships with the ocean. And so the project is trying to understand the clash of these different kinds of visions. So how do they actually jostle for space with each other? How do they sort of accumulate or act against each other, cut against each other? And what kinds of possible imaginations for designing the future that they give rise to? So the two things the project particularly tries to understand is, how do these different visions see the sea? How do they understand the ocean? And two, what are the kinds of futures they enable us to construct for the ocean? And so again, those are questions that require the input of different forms of knowledge, including physical, geological, biological, chemical, geochemical, that kind of knowledge, but also a lot of normative knowledge, philosophical, sociological, economic, and so on, historical. And the project basically tries to provide a sort of the locus for bringing these different forms of knowledges together and really thinking with how these knowledges have been used at different levels by different kinds of groups to construct a range of ideas about what we think of as the ocean when we think about it, and then what we think of as our futures vis-a-vis the ocean.
Okay, that's very wonderful. Every time you start answering me, I'm very immersed. I feel like there is a couple of waves falling on my back, and I'm thinking it. So very quickly to conclude that, is there a hard stop on the project? Are you those who are listening, I'm sure is fans of your work, have heard about you in some capacity. Those who are not, maybe are in one of these sciences, would want to get involved.
Yeah.
So what are you, is there an open positioning on this, or is there a hard stop on the project?
No, there'll be a start and a stop. So the project will formally commence on the 1st of June 2026.
Okay.
And it stops 5 years from that. In terms of the funding, ends 5 years from that, right? Okay. And in the course of that period, there'll be a few things happening. There'll be the recruitment of a few postdocs who will work on the project. We'll be setting up a couple of interesting interactive platforms that allow us to showcase a lot of what we discover. People will be publishing their own work on particular sites, which will be more in-depth work. And there'll be hopefully a couple of conferences and things like that. That will be exciting for people. We might try to do an ocean festival at one point. So there's a lot of there's a timeline of activities that's planned. And so between 2026 and 2031, please do if you feel like you want to get involved with the task of rethinking what the future of the ocean can be, what we think of as radical futures, or what we think of as revolutionary futures, or what we just think of as human futures, or different, or whatever it is. And if you'd like to get involved, if you'd like to share your thoughts, please do get in touch with me.
Okay, and it's very interesting, because most often when we work with law, we're very often, especially in academia, we're involved within our own clique, where we are with just lawyers. So this is a very fascinating proposition for you to be involved with people from other disciplinary sciences to really understand, how really is H2O made, as simple as
absolutely
as that gets. Okay, quickly on the next question, of course, quoting you again, a space both real and imagined. That's how you imagine ocean, a space which is both real and imagination. I assume that we have discussed this quite a bit already in this conversation, and you have, from very brief summary, you feel it's very real, and in an imaginatory sense, you also feel that if it's not recuperated with the right actions, it can be no more an imagination, to say the least. On that point, I will also throw in a fact so that you can quickly answer on this as well. The Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is very often brought up in debates now, this zone is in the Pacific, and everyone is navigating towards that. It's more become the commonly Vasco da Gama point where everyone really wants to get to the point, scientists, governments, political institutions, to check what more can we mine there. So why is metals important? I think the world knows now, because the world is a very capital market facing front. We are moving towards the direction where it's no more communism, capitalism. It's more on the level of autocracy, and where everything merges around what really is the return on investment, right? And most everyday functioning operative understanding of the world is largely invested in metals. Gone are the days when gold was an investment in India, both aesthetically and operationally. Now we're really looking towards nickel, copper. Copper is a very unsaid metal that is largely used not just in cables but in many other industries. And of course, how can we not forget the semiconductor industry and the chips. Let us know a little bit about the Clarion-Clipperton zone.
And I think the analogy you drew with the Vasco da Gama, the Indies, is very good, because in a way the CCZ, the Clarion-Clipperton zone, has that same promise that the Indies once held, right? The sense that this is a place that is full of rich and precious things, and we need to access it and get these things. It's very similar for the Clarion-Clipperton zone. Now, the reason this very technically named zone, it's just called that because it's between two faults, the Clarion Fault and the Clipperton Fault. The reason it comes into prominence is that it has a very rich, it's a part of the Pacific seabed, and it has a very rich concentration of minerals deposits. So a lot of manganese nodules, and also some deposits in other kinds of mineral formations. And so there's obviously that leads to a lot of excitement, right? So there's a whole very vast seabed, but within that vast seabed, particular seams have been identified as being especially promising for seabed mining and so on. And the Clarion-Clipperton zone is very full of these. And so that's why you have a lot of states and a lot of corporations that are interested in getting mining licenses for this zone. And that's why out of the 31 mining licenses that have been issued to states and corporations, I think it's something like 17 of these or 16 of these for the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So if you look at a map of the Clarion-Clipperton zone, just by reference to the allocation of mining sites, it really looks like a crazy jigsaw puzzle where everybody's sort of mining claims are running into literally locking with everybody else's. This vast 5,000 kilometer zone is really divided up into a series of mining sites on the one hand, and this is why other kinds of scientists are interested, it's also very biodiversity rich. It's very interesting in terms of the forms of life that they found in the zone. And so that is why also there's a tussle between those who want this to be protected as areas of environmental interest and those who then want to see it as a mining site. So that's what is going on with the Clarion-Clipperton zone.
Okay, that's great. And I think also it's very interesting to see how, which will direct me to my next question, which is almost the third end or the fourth of our conversation, where we need to at some point touch about loss, because we've really understood the basics of how ocean works and what really are we doing with the ocean, how are we having our own scavenger hunt on it, are there really pirates on it, etc. So now going to the legal side of things. So firstly, the question for rookie understanding is, we know that there was, we have territories and there was League of Nations. We do have our own states, territorial rights, even though at this very moment there are very active wars where the boundaries are being breached and all the international laws are being infringed. And it's quite saddening. But do the oceans have lines and territories?
Yes.
Do we, and how far are we regulated there? And of course, and I have to talk about the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, where we also note that the common heritage of humankind. Do you feel this is just a moral or legal implications, or do you still feel there is territoriality even between the seas and it cannot be treated as just one huge project?
Sure. Yeah, no, really important. And in fact, if you'd asked me right in the beginning, what do I mean when I say the ocean is crowded? Well, what is it crowded with? one of the things it is crowded with is law. So there's actually a lot of law in the sea. So again, the ocean is often constructed in the popular imagination as a sort of lawless space, right? Once you're out in the high seas, you can do anything. But that's not actually true. There's a lot of law of the sea. There is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which you mentioned, which is sometimes called the Constitution of the Ocean, on the basis that it provides a sort of general framework that explains which states have rights where and in what respect, and then sort of is filled out by more specific legislation on various topics. But in addition to that, there are, I think, at the least count, even if you count just the period between 1945 and 1982, and there's more than 55 international treaties, that number has probably doubled since then. There are, in addition to that, thousands of bilateral agreements. There are, there's a lot of customary international law. There are the rules and regulations issued by the many different international institutions that have jurisdiction over different activities in the sea. And there are lots of other non-binding memorandums of agreement. There are, there's a lot of law of the sea. And in fact, that's why for a lot of law of the sea experts, the question of, okay, what is the law that governs X activity or Y activity can be really lead to a full-time, it can become a full-time project, right? You can write an entire book saying, what is the law on piracy actually, or what is the law on maritime interdiction, or what is the law on fisheries? Because there's a lot that you have to sort of sift through to even understand. In most activities have a lot of legal regulation. They're quite densely regulated. But that is then leads to its own interesting question. If there is so much law in the sea, then why are there so many problems? Why is it that we don't actually have the answers to the questions we're asking about overfishing or about the ocean fragility or about environmental fragility? So that then brings us to this question of, okay, there is a lot of law in the sea, but what does the law really do? Does it assist more with creating ocean perils, or does it help us to solve ocean perils? Is the thrust on extraction, or is the thrust on distribution and solidarity and environmental protection as we would like it to be? And in that context, then thinking about what do concepts like the common heritage of mankind do become quite interesting. So the common heritage of mankind, just for some listeners who might not know, is a particular principle that applies to one part of the ocean, which is the seabed, deep seabed, the air that is beyond national jurisdiction. That is regulated on the principle that it's the common heritage of mankind, which means that its resources should be extracted for the benefit of mankind. And there's an entire legal edifice built on the basis that this principle should be realized. Now, in theory, this sounds very nice, right? Seems to go right back to the idea of third world states, that we should have extraction that actually is for the benefit of everyone. But what we've seen is that the way the regime has developed is that the question of what counts to the benefit of mankind has been translated from a question of, okay, everybody should participate collectively in this activity, everybody should be able to share in the activity, to something that is much more familiar in the sense of rewarding a few people with huge profits, but imposing costs on everybody else. So the benefit of mankind has gone from a regime of solidarity to saying we must reward corporations for just recovering these minerals, because, as you said, critical minerals are so important today and everybody wants them to feed into industrial processes, that work is seen as enough in its own right. So legally, the common heritage of mankind exists. It's not just a nice term. There's a whole legal architecture built around it. But what the architecture does is similar to what a lot of the other laws of the sea do, which is that they basically establish jurisdictions that enable more exploitation of the ocean, and sometimes don't actually, and not sometimes, but actually all of the time, don't do enough to think about the ecological questions and the distribution questions, which should be actually just as important, given that we are talking about something that we call a global commons.
Yeah, well, wonderful. And I'm just going to, again, conclude that part for us. Mm-hmm. So the answer is there is very much territoriality with the sea. Yeah. With the country, there is also a very sheer territoriality with what can be done alongside their country. Yeah. And vis-a-vis, if I were to be another country, I do very much need approvals and recognition from your country in order to exploit for your benefit.
Well, and in fact, going further, so there is, of course, so different states have different extents of national jurisdiction, right? So the common thumb rule is, to keep in mind, is that up to 200 miles out from the coast of a state is generally within that state's jurisdiction in some form or the other. Beyond that is technically what is high seas or what is the international seabed area. But even there are particular high seas regimes and deep seabed regimes that basically, again, make this about getting licenses to do particular things. So within areas within national jurisdiction, you need permissions from other states. Certain permissions are written into the law of the sea in terms of the freedom of navigation and so on, that those are all legal institutions. Beyond national jurisdiction is very similar. So again, it's not just fisheries, for example, beyond national jurisdiction might be regulated by regional fisheries management organizations. Seabed exploration and exploitation is regulated by the International Seabed Authority. So there are regimes in place that address all parts of the sea. Some are regimes that delegate powers to national jurisdictions. Others set up international institutions to manage areas. There are also some regimes that are basically called that introduce what are called area-based management rules, right? So they'll introduce marine protected areas or no fishing zones or no navigational zones in certain parts of the sea on the basis of arguments of ecological fragility. So there is a lot of jurisdiction divided between international institutions and states.
Okay, that's wonderful to know. Just a very funny but intriguing question that comes to my mind. Those who do not read or understand a lot about the oceans and the seas, simply because it's not a syllabus that's involved very largely in a coming of age criteria, and especially from the global south that we come, and we were given the kind of academic education to substantiate the reading. I want to understand. Is there any part of the ocean that is not proprietary to any particular state, territory, indigenous community that's still left with the refugee status of the ocean?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, technically, of course, both the seabed beyond national jurisdictions and the high seas are they're not part of state jurisdictions, but they come under the remit of a lot of international institutions. I think to find any part of the sea that is not touched by jurisdiction in some way would be difficult. What you will find is that sometimes it's a question of whose law are we thinking with. Because if we were thinking with the ways in which certain indigenous communities understand the ocean, we'd find that their understanding their historical relationship with the ocean and also what their knowledge system and what their juridical system is around the ocean is probably not recognized at all in the sort of more traditional Western international law. And so to that extent, you find that certain conceptions of ocean ownership are erased in certain parts of the sea, right? So in a way, I would say that it's not that any part of the ocean is untouched by jurisdiction. It's more even that there are multiple knowledge traditions and juridical traditions that address various parts of the ocean. The problem is that only some of them find articulation or recognition as legal systems, and others are dismissed as purely affective, emotional, historical, but not legal systems. So there's more law, in fact, I would say not less law to be found. I think that sense that there's a world, there's an ocean out there that is legally untouched I just don't think it's true.
Okay, I'm going to save my concluding remarks to bombard you with what is going on in my head on this. So we have come to the very end of this podcast questions, because I have infinite script that I could keep going on, but because your answers and your intriguing sub questions to me was so wide and vast. Generally, when I have guests, I have to kind of push them to give me an entire overview of things. But it's so interesting that I could see that there is a lot of energy, interest, and substantial input of why you love the ocean so much. We all love something unconditionally, and I'm very glad it's the ocean for you. Before we end the podcast and discuss what we would like to change about the oceans, and I ask all my guests, and this is probably my favorite segment in my podcast, where there is a whole section where we say of the guests. It's a very lighter, non-ocean related, very loose on the shoulder question. So what's your favorite book, and what's the one movie that changed your life? This can be regional, non-regional, does not need to be intense. We've had guests tell that their favorite book was even something from a children college.
Yeah. No, I can totally see that. I guess the difficulty is always saying what is your favorite. So I am a huge reader of books, and from when I can tell you, even as a child, I used to be sometimes so greedy to be reading. I would read like 3 books at a time, right? So to find any one book that is a favorite is difficult. There are, of course, books that teach you different things, right? So there are books that open your mind up to the different possibilities of language and how you can work with. One book that people often talk about in this context is something like Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, right? Where they see how it's possible to blend Indian language traditions with English, right? To change how English is written itself. Or another book that I often read is called A Suitable Boy. Every time I'm homesick for India, or every time I feel like I'm missing, Delhi or whatever, this is a book that is basically about post-colonial. It's the 50s, 60s in India, and it takes you right back into a society that is deeply familiar to me. But the book that I would recommend very heavily for your readers, and this is because you asked me about ocean imagination, is and how we can think about the ocean, is a book. It's not that it's necessarily a very literary book. It's a thriller. It's called The Swarm. It was initially a German book that was translated into English. And it's a book it was also made into a TV series, but it's about what happens when the ocean starts fighting back, right? It's been written by a biologist. So it has these wonderful bits where different groups of things. It starts with this scene of orcas attacking boats. And this book was written 15 years ago. We've seen last year in the news orcas attacking boats, right? Because of climate change. And it sort of takes us from there into people get attacked by, sea worms. They get attacked by crabs. And it's building up to something larger. But it's a wonderful book about what happens when the ocean assumes active agency and you start feeling its impacts more as human beings. So do read that book. And TV shows or films, again, hard to say what changed your life because I'm a binge watcher. I watch all sorts of things. But one thing I watch a lot, again and again, is, it's going to sound very funny, but Star Trek: The Next Generation, The Enterprise. It's really a wonderful show with philosophy and politics and so on about what it means to encounter other worlds and engage with them and trying to understand them. And so not the first series, the second series, The Next Generation, which is less fighty and more sort of philosophical, is the one I really like too.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. This has been wonderful, and I must say that when I came into the talk, I'm a huge believer, being a lawyer and also now an academic in the whole ecosystem of law, to believe that there is a time and age where law is always relevant and prevalent. From what you spoke, I think the only laws that is still respected today, despite of everything that's happening around us, is the law of the seas.
Yeah.
So I'm very grateful and thankful, and everyone is, for all the good work that you're putting in. And we really hope the lines are not blurred, and we navigate from the red to the green and the blue zone. I hope may the ocean and the force stay with you. Thank you very much for coming and speaking to me.
Thank you so much, Pooja. It was really a pleasure.